Good evening. Welcome to the 22nd Monna and Otto Weinmann Annual Lecture, which is being organized by the museum's Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies. My name is Victoria Barnett, and I'm the director of the Mandel Center Programs on Ethics, Religion, and the Holocaust. The Mandel Center is the most foremost interdisciplinary research center on Holocaust scholarship today. We sponsor a number of programs and opportunities for scholars, too many for me to list here, but I hope you will take advantage of the materials about our programs that are available in the foyer outside the auditorium. Before turning to more important matters, I'd like to just mention a few logistical details. This is a good time to silence your cell phones and any other electronic devices. This evening's program is being live streamed, and so I'd also like to welcome at this point our online audience. There will be time for questions following the lecture, and we will be distributing index cards for that purpose. So if you have a question for Dr. Afridi this evening, please write it on the index card. Museum staff will be collecting these cards, and I hope we can get to as many of them as possible after the lecture. Thank you. The Monna and Otto Weinmann Annual Lecture is one of the Mandel Center's hallmark programs, and I would like at this point to express our deep appreciation and gratitude to Janice Weinmann-Shorenstein and her family, who are here tonight. In 1995, Janice Weinmann-Shorenstein endowed this lecture as a tribute to her parents, Monna and Otto Weinmann, and in honor of all Holocaust survivors. This museum owes a particular debt to our survivors and to the Weinmanns for their support and commitment to keeping this history and its legacy alive. The museum still has over 80 survivor volunteers who engage over 100,000 of our visitors every year through programs and conversations. Janice Weinmann-Shorenstein's commitment to all survivors and to the ongoing scholarship at the Mandel Center has made it possible for us to invite leading Holocaust scholars, some of whom were themselves witnesses to the Nazi terror, to deliver the annual Weinmann Lecture. Previous lectures have included Randolph Graham, Peter Gay, Deborah Lipstadt, and Susanna Heschel, and we continue this distinguished tradition this evening with Dr. Mehnaz Afridi. And I'd like to welcome Dr. Afridi as well as her husband Scott and her daughter Ruya, who are with us this evening. We're delighted to have Janice Weinmann-Shorenstein, her husband Stuart Shorenstein, and their daughter Marissa with us this evening. It is now my pleasure to invite Janice to the podium to say a few words. Janice.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you so much to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and to Sarah Bloomberg, who is here tonight, who, as you know, is the leader of this venerable institution. We're very honored, Sarah, that you would join us. The course of people's lives during the Holocaust took many paths and many trajectories. For those who were lucky, their fate was made easy by the timely refuge to receptive locations. For those on the other end of the spectrum, life was cut short by death in their homes, in their ghettos, on transports, in concentration camps, in fields to which they fled, and in other ways documented, described, and discussed since 1945. In 1991, after both my parents had died, we closed down their apartment, and during the course of dismantling it, found, among other things, a box full of letters to each other during World War II. We left the box untouched for many years until 2012, when we finally decided to open its contents. It was not until 2014, however, that we donated the original letters to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and only since a few months ago, through the museum's extensive and committed work, that we were able to read through the completed, categorized, cataloged, and translated letters. My father lived in Prague, and in 1939 became part of the Czech army under French command, took part in the Allied campaign and the liberation of Dunkirk, and fought until the end of 1945. His entire family was killed in Auschwitz. My mother fled from Vienna, from where much of her family was captured, to London in 1939. In 1943, she married my father and gave birth to me in England in 1944. During the entire time of their correspondence, from 1942 through 1945, my father was on the front line while my mother was living through the Blitz in London. Throughout the Holocaust, another war was being waged by those not killed by the Nazis. It was a war of the battlefield fought on behalf of others as well as oneself. It was a war of civilians fighting to live to see the next day and to reunite with their families. It was a war of constant exposure and vulnerability, of uninterrupted anxiety and uncertainty. These letters provide a picture of pain, panic, and fear that are often not central to the Holocaust narrative. They are the backstory of people trying to overcome not immediate and imminent death, but rather to deal with the perennial threat of it. During the many years of my mother's stories, the theme of evacuating from buildings in which she lived because of bomb threats and, in fact, bomb explosions are chilling and gripping. Equally disturbing are the unanswered questions she asks my father about his constant exposure to danger, his handling of the unceasing barrage of army fire, his responsibility for guarding his comrades. Each lapse in response from him raises the possibility of never hearing from him again. And he, in turn, feels responsible for not being able to address her needs of comfort, proximity, and affection because of his commitment to a higher calling. Monna, how many times have I declared my love for you? But on the other hand, I can't just betray the ideals for which we are fighting and the people who we now see living in the most miserable and most perilous circumstances. I am near a breakdown as it is. My dear Monna, I'm already anticipating that I will just collapse someday. My nerves cannot bear such actual inhumanity. Accompanying these two parallel themes of pain and fear, responsibility and obligation, was the overwhelming need to address the fate of other loved ones. Letter after letter mentions another person to be sought after, another source of information to be pursued, a new contact from which to garner the status of those so close to their hearts. Most consistent was the desperate search for my uncle, who left Prague for the Dutch underground and through years of searching was never to be found. It was only recently, and partially because of this museum, that I learned that my uncle died in Birkenau only a few weeks before the conclusion of World War II. Who knows if this letter will ever reach you? Who knows if you are still alive? It has been longer than 2 years that I have last heard from you. Since then, nothing at all. In my thoughts, I was often, I dare say, every day with you. I am worrying about why it may not be possible to receive news from you. I have asked at every Red Cross. So really, the only hope left to me was that fate might make it happen that you will still emerge safe and sound from the turbulence. Yet the letters expose not only the pervasive cloud under which these individuals lived, but also the quest, even the clamoring for reassurance, hope, and love that they desperately sought. It is raining terribly, and I think of you, think about how loud and terrible it is for you. Cold and damp and bombs and destruction all around you. Oh, Utti, how much I would give to know that you and the others were past this hard time. Remember how deeply we love you, and maybe it will help you get through this hard time. Please keep well for our sake, because we love you so. The narrative of the Holocaust is mostly centered around the lives of those we lost. But the lives of those who endured this less critical, but sometimes deeply damaging experiences provide us with an explanation, a context for the ensuing history of our people. For those who experienced loss and fear, hope and determination came the legacy of the next generation. Many stories have shown the need of children of those who died, but also those who survived but suffered to compensate for their parents' experiences. Case after case confirms the strong sense of obligation that my generation has felt to rebuild a world of justice, enduring peace and compassion, one in which our relatives' expressions of hope can be realized and their struggles justified. No words can describe my distress and despair by reading your letter of June 1. Oh, my darling, dearest darling, don't be so sad and do not see the future so dark. Remember the time where we were suffering so much because of our baby and everything turned out all right. Darling, you will see that our future life will be a wonderful one, full of love and happiness, and we will be with our beloved ones together. Do not lose hope. And so, I conclude my remarks tonight by recognizing the continued and collective role that we play in fulfilling this organization's mission, never forgetting, always committing to a better future, and forever pursuing an existence worthy of the sacrifices made and hope endured during the Holocaust. Thank you. Before I turn it over for the official introduction of Dr. Afridi, I would just like to say a few words about what a special opportunity you will all have tonight. I met Dr. Afridi 2 years ago in my home when she spoke about the Shoah. Her perceptions, her outlook, her insights from a very different point than we usually hear is something that you will see as a unique experience. And we're deeply grateful to her and honored that she's joining us tonight. Thank you.
Janice, thank you so very much for those very moving words. It's now my honor to introduce Professor Mehnaz Afridi, Director of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Interfaith Education Center at Manhattan College, where she is also Assistant Professor of Religious Studies and teaches courses on the Holocaust and Islamic Studies. Dr. Afridi's research focuses on Muslim identity, with an emphasis on Europe and Islam, Muslims and Jews in Italian culture, and the challenges of contemporary anti-Semitism. She has been doing groundbreaking research on the often overlooked stories of cooperation between Jews and Muslims during the Holocaust. She is the author of a forthcoming book, The Shoah Through Muslim Eyes, and she was co-editor of Global Perspectives on Orhan Pamuk, Existentialism and Politics. She currently serves on the museum's Committee on Ethics, Religion, and the Holocaust. In her lecture this evening, she will discuss her work as a Muslim scholar of the Holocaust and its implications for interreligious dialogue today, especially for contemporary conversations about anti-Semitism. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Afridi.
Thank you. I just want to say Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you, and shalom to all of you here, and thank you for coming out on such a beautiful night. I'd rather be out there on the grass than here. I'm really honored to be here at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, which has become a second home for me over the last few years. I want to further thank Mehnaz Weinmann, Shorenstein, and her family for honoring me with this invitation to give the annual Otto and Monna Weinmann lecture. I just whispered to her that my middle name is actually Monna. It's a very popular name in the Arabic world. Janice and I worked together on defining Zionism with Hadassah's women's group in New York, so I've been fortunate to have worked with her and now am friends with her. Thank you to the museum staff that has been so kind and patient with my schedule and all the bookings, and especially special thanks to Victoria Barnett, my friend, and also the Jack Joseph Morton Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies. And finally, I'd like to commend you, Sarah Bloomfield, for having me here as a Muslim at this museum, to be able to share some observations and my own work as a Holocaust and Islamic scholar tonight. Thank you. Tonight, I'd like to begin with a story that is freshly engraved in my mind to set some context for all of us in terms of what I do and how I find certain redefinitions of antisemitism, also Islamophobia, and stories of cooperation. And what can we do in this world today that is tense, stricken with racism, prejudice, fear, and misunderstanding? This last January, I was fortunate enough to spend 3 weeks in Venice, Italy, where I co-taught a class on Abrahamic and artistic crossroads in Venice from 1300 to the present at the Jewish ghetto, which also celebrated its 500th anniversary this last March. It's the oldest ghetto in the world. As we took 18 Manhattan College students to Venice during the winter intercession, we became the glaring and visible group of Americans during the off-tourist season. Learning in the classroom, aula didactica, in the ghetto, generously loaned by the Jewish Museum, walking in and out of hidden synagogues from the 15th to the 17th centuries, standing in the campo of the ghetto, reimagining the many victims who were taken and killed in Auschwitz in 1944. We were a rare group, breaking the myth of the romantic Venice, exploring the darker corridors of this history. We were visited by the local Jewish community, rabbis, local Catholics, and Muslims, who discussed the struggles of life in Venice and the larger Italian culture that seemed disaffected by the history of Venice as one of the most multicultural cities 500 years ago. We listened to the struggles of the Senegalese and the Bengali migrants that sold roses and even drugs to make ends meet in a place where Muslims were seen as a threat and uncivilized. Jews, the remaining few, had become invisible, and the ghetto has become a tourist destination. The invisibility of Jews and the visibility now of Muslim immigrants intrigued me as I thought about this lecture tonight. I thought of how Europe is indeed different, how it once held a deep, caustic, and at times intimate relationship and exchange with both Jews and Muslims. These reflections and more drew me to think about my own identity as a Muslim American woman who teaches the Holocaust and Islam at a Catholic institution as a freedom that I may only enjoy in the United States. I believe that living in the United States is where the discussions of such religious cooperation are possible, and we must take responsibility for this, even under the recent dramatic political remarks about suspicions of Muslims and other minorities in America. So I want you to keep this story in mind in terms of Italy. So I ask tonight, how can one redefine anti-Semitism? What does this mean in light of the rise of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia today? How can one re-envision the stories of Jews and Muslims pre, during, and post-World War II? Tonight, I'd like to make 3 points. 1, how Islamophobia and anti-Semitism have common roots and how they have surfaced in different times, being conscious that Islamophobia has not led to the colossal event as the Holocaust. And 2, the tensions within the two communities that are rooted not just in political prejudice, but a form of racism that grew before the Holocaust during the time of colonialism. And finally, I would like to offer some stories of hope and courage of Muslim rescuers during the Holocaust. So bear with me as I travel with you from one continent to another, mapping different incidences, histories, and cooperation that led me to this type of work. We are facing many questions today, globally, whether Muslim or not, from the cruel collective and heroic individual memories of the Crusades, colonialism, communism, genocide, imperialism, more recently 9/11, ISIS, and recent rise of antisemitism and Islamophobia. However, these are not just memories, but consecrated traces that are challenging to break and have divided us and others. Memories of one another that have an aura of the sacred to different communities at different times, or figuring an unwritten history that is neither that of Europe and the Jews, nor the Islam and the West. The picture is far more complicated, my friends, and needs to be sorted out through historical analysis. As the two terms remain to be ambiguous but persuasive, as Dr. Korndorfer states, its force lies precisely in its ambiguity. One moment, the target is the religion itself. For example, Islam is violent, literalist, backward. Judaism is anti-modern, exclusivist, backward. Judaism is anti-modern, exclusivist, legalistic. While at the next moment, the focus is on individuals to whom all kinds of negative characteristics are attributed. Furthermore, Edward Said suggested that hostility to Islam in the modern Christian West has historically gone hand in hand and has stemmed from the same source and has been nourished at the same stream as anti-Semitism. He proposed that a critique of Western attitudes towards Islam should contribute to an enlargement of our understanding of the cultural mechanisms of anti-Semitism. Similarly, I believe research on anti-Semitism may broaden our understanding of Islamophobia. Perhaps understanding of Islamophobia may broaden our understanding of anti-Semitism. There are two specific parallels between anti-Semitism and Islamophobia that fall into two categories, race and religion. The racialization of Jews began much earlier than we can think back, with the accusations of deicide within Christianity, the blood libel, the acquisition of the Protocols of Zion, and the unique devastation of the Holocaust is a tragedy beyond compare in terms of its scale, its singular efficacy in pursuing its dreadful goal, and its effect on the people it targeted, the Jews. I do argue in my work that the Holocaust is unprecedented, but I also do not engage in the Olympics of genocide, as it's called, that cannot advance the understanding of the common ground from which both hatreds stem from. The scale of the Holocaust surpasses that of any event in the history of Islamophobia, yet the character of the rhetoric is in some cases comparable. This is so especially if one compares anti-Semitism before the Holocaust with Islamophobia today. Similarities between the two hatreds are most apparent when one makes a diachronic comparison. Both anti-Jewish and anti-Muslim feelings are very old, but the modern form of anti-Semitism matured in the late 19th century. It was practiced for well over 50 years before the ultimate violence of the Holocaust. The period between the 1870s and 1940s, which coincided with imperialist conflict, as well as with large-scale immigration to the imperialist metropoles, including by hundreds of thousands of Jews, may be termed the period of classical, definite anti-Semitism. Then when did anti-Semitism appear in the Muslim or Arab world? As Norman Stillman states, modern post-Enlightenment anti-Semitism seems to have made very little headway in the Arab world during the 19th century. The earliest examples of modern anti-Semitism literature in the European mold did not make their appearance until the last 3 decades of the century among Syrian, Lebanese Christians who were under strong French cultural influences. On the other hand, its characteristics, antisemitism, have resurfaced with a vengeance in Islamophobia as well. There is also much dissimilarity due in large measure to the radical difference in the historical context. The similarities between pre-Holocaust antisemitism and present-day Islamophobia are striking enough to invite a serious exploration, in the context of differences that are also important. The images, characterization of Jews and Arabs can be seen side by side with deviant depictions of Jews and Arabs in art going back to the colonial days. The dark Jew, the dark Arab, the Oriental Jew and the Oriental Arab, the aggressive Jew, the aggressive Arab, the Jew that commits deicide, the Arab that wants to take over the world. These are ongoing images that we see. This is pre-Holocaust in terms of Jews and Islamophobia today. Yet there are three main characteristics of antisemitism and Islamophobia that distinguish them from other forms of religious, ethnic, or racial hatred. First, both the Jew and Muslim are seen by those who hate them as belonging to a rival civilization that threatens to destroy the West. In this imagined clash of civilizations, Judaism and Islam have for most of history, though less so more recently, been classed as two of a kind. Islamophobia has been largely formed with the vocabulary and imagery of earlier Judeophobia, and modern antisemitism was substantially influenced by imperialist racial fantasies about the founding people of Islam. Second, this alleged clash of civilizations is imagined as the Jews for anti-Semites or the Muslims for Islamophobes, striving to subjugate the Western Christian world through world domination. And third, Muslims or Jews, as the case may be, are accused of plotting to take over the world through various forms of conspiracy, i.e. Sharia, uniting the internal enemy within the Christian West with the external enemy. The conspirators, Muslims or Jews, are accused of double loyalty. They prefer their international ethno-religious community's interests to those of their host nation. For the anti-Semite, every Jew supports the Jews' alleged domination of the world, Israel, though some may publicly dissimulate their intentions for tactical reasons. For the Islamophobe, every Muslim is an extreme jihadist, though some may simulate the moderate. As Sandra Gilman has pointed out, most Muslims in the West come out of a national tradition often formed by colonialism, in which their homelands had long histories disturbed but not destroyed by colonial rule. And at last but not least, the Israel-Palestinian conflict over the past century, well before the creation of the State of Israel, the establishment of a Jewish homeland, as well as the Holocaust, seems to place the two groups, at least, in the consciousness of the West into two antagonistic camps. The state of Muslims today in Europe has been a long-standing issue of assimilation and how many Muslims immigrated from poor Asian African countries to make a life in Europe. In the 1950s, Britain, Germany, and France had a dire need for labor and allowed an influx of Muslim immigrants to enter their borders. In the United States, the picture is different, even though the antisemitism and Islamophobia was carried here historically in the same manner. Yet the racism here is one that has dissipated for Jews from the 18th and 19th century and risen from Muslims since the 1970s on to 9/11 and today Muslim American terrorism. So there are some similarities between Islamophobia and antisemitism in different diachronic historical periods. They're very, very important. Second point, more poignantly, one that is very complicated, is the issue of anti-Semitism within Muslim communities, especially seen in the attacks on Jews in Europe, where they're perceived as the allies to the European ideals versus Semitic, Arab, or Eastern alliances. The Jew has been redefined in the imagination of the Muslim and Arab mind to be aligned with the colonial force in light of the image of Jews as being Europeans, assimilated and coddled by the West, and finally, the support for Israel as an ally of the West. A confusing but bewildering pattern, but one which comes down to deep racism and religious racism based on several research studies, both in America and in Europe, where young urban males and females identified Jews as anti-Muslims, Muslim conspirators, uncivilized, and those that broke off an important contract with the Prophet Muhammad in the 7th century. For example, the events in Paris, January 2015, compel me to reflect on the many violent acts in France, including the kidnapping, torture, and murder of Ilan Halimi by the so-called Gang de Barbares, the slaughter of children at a Jewish day school by Mohamed Merah, which is 2012, the carnage unleashed at the Jewish Museum of Brussels by French national Mehdi Nemmouche. The responses so far have been of sorrow and regret. So how can we comprehend this rampage, this mistrust between the two communities, even though both are marginalized? We have yet to witness a direct analysis of how and why Muslims or Jews in France are experiencing a rise of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia through extremist Muslim groups and from right-wing groups all over. The attacks against Charlie Hebdo, a satirical magazine in France, created uproar, and then the Jewish grocery store shooting, in which, ironically, the one who saved the Jews was a Muslim, Lassani Batilda, an employee at the Paris kosher grocery store, Hyper Caché, who saved people by hiding them in a walk-in freezer, was quoted saying, "We are brothers. It's not a question of Jews, of Christians, or of Muslims. We're all in the same boat. We have to help each other to get out of this crisis." These very confusing statements and actions complicate the scene more, as these acts of kindness, of violence under the guise of faith demonstrate that perhaps there is a need for revision, reform, and redefinition of what is this kind of anti-Semitism. The clash of East and West, or civilized and uncivilized, seems to have been reignited here. The clash is not simply a binary struggle against a religion or culture, but a complex and nuanced identity that is being challenged by its own history of Islam, colonialism, wars, genocide, and its own internal conflicts. The new anti-Semitism, which is often associated with extremist Muslim groups or even Muslims, is similar to the old European anti-Semitism with two added layers. One, which are Quranic readings, sacred validation of such a perception, and two, Israel and the loss of Palestine and the power in the Middle East. Jews and Muslims have lived together since the inception of Islam, whether under Christian or Muslim empires. They have shared many experiences and do to this day. Since 1948, the current uneasy relationship between Jews and Muslims is historically very new. Although most people believe in the myth that Jews and Muslims have been at war for years, the current conflict is a relatively new one, with repercussions that affect Jewish-Muslim relations everywhere in the world. For example, Günter Jacali has conducted a research analysis of 117 young Muslim men living in Europe and their view on Jews. He found that their views were based on inaccurate historical information, and they did not have any concrete historical or religious foundation for their perception of Jews. The following is a very good example of the historical perspective on hostility between Jews and Muslims, and you can see this in many, many narratives. I'm going to present you with one. Participants often refer to Islamic history or conflicts between Muhammad and his adherents on one side, and Jewish tribes on the other, to illustrate and justify enmity against Jews. Muslims' hostilities against Jews today were framed as a revenge against Jews for things they did in the past, or part of an ongoing historical struggle with the Jews. However, references to Islamic history were usually very, very vague. The following French interviewer's argument is a good example. He was not sure what particular kind of mischief Jews made, but he was adamant that the Jews are to blame, that what they did is unforgivable, and their actions resulted in eternal animosity between Muslims and Jews. Here's Sabri and the interviewer. "We have a history with them," he says. I don't know much about the kind of thing, but a long time ago, I think that they were the ones who betrayed the prophet. After that, the Muslims, there's a story like that. Yeah, that's the one. It's something that makes it worth going to war with them. So the interviewer asks, even now? He says, no, not war, but we don't talk to them. It's not a war between Arabs and Jews. And I don't know, it's about religion. They did something that wasn't good. And it's unpardonable. It's weird. You can't. Everyone is obsessed about it, meaning the Jews. They have to change it. It's the Jews who did something bad. It's too late. It was the beginning, and given the way they are. There was nothing, Sabri said in his narrative, that gave any concrete information. Sabri emphasized that the enmity was related to religion somehow, and mentioned an alleged betrayal of Muhammad by the Jews, but he was uncertain about this event. Jacali, although situates his research in Europe, the themes are similar in many of the Muslim communities that discuss the betrayal of Muhammad, mistrust of Jews, Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Jews dispelling Muslims from their lands, Jews are materialistic, and many other themes that are present in present-day Muslims, not just in Europe, but their own respective countries, including the United States. Examples of these that I have witnessed also come from educated Muslims that believe in the control and power of Jews, and educated Jews that believe in the power and control of Muslim extremists. One of the examples that I want to give is from France and Jews and Muslims, which is the lessons that we can learn in North Africa. What and how did this tension begin? From 1948 to 1962, had significant repercussions in France. First, from many French Jewish leaders preoccupied with rebuilding from the recent Nazi and Vichy persecutions, the Jewish meanings in French decolonization were all too clear. While those on the left expressed empathy for Muslim victims of French racism and called for Muslim-Jewish cooperation throughout the Algerian crisis, many of those representing major Jewish institutions or publications echoed fears that the Arab world had turned on its Jewish residents. As a result, distrust and animosity, rather than commonalities and cooperation, tended to dominate mainstream institutional representations of the Arab world, a broad designation that often collapsed Muslim North Africans uncritically within it. And what we see here is the beginnings of the antisemitism and Islamophobia from both communities. Thus, the vanishing Arabs and their reemerging allies from World War II created a distance between Jews and Muslims, yet they shared in the status of minority within the colonial gaze. Some of these factors have fed misperceptions on one another, and then there are misperceptions that stem from ignorance of each other's religious traditions. But as these aspects show, many of these understandings and misunderstandings are connected in profound ways. They mirror one another, offering an opportunity not just for disagreement, but for dialogue. At the same time, we see different stories emerge during the Holocaust, stories that we need to encounter as both Jews and Muslims, the stories that I believe that need to be brought out. I ask myself this question all the time. Is there a way for interreligious dialogue to make them shared concerns or at least common conversations? In response to these different understandings and sometimes competing interpretations, a growing number of interfaith alliances, documentaries, and scholars have attempted to bridge the gaps, especially by looking at the history of Muslims during the Holocaust, hence my final point. They have documented how Albanians, mostly Muslims, rescued Jews, how the Grand Mosque of Paris issued certificates, provided shelter to the persecuted minority, how Tunisians, Moroccans, and Algerians protected both French and North African Jews from occupied forces. These stories are important to both Jews and Muslims. The stories of rescue come both as a welcome surprise, as a shock for both groups too. Jews welcome the examples of the Muslim heroes who willfully risk their lives in the name of Islam and justice. The Islamic principles come across strongly and paint a different image of Muslims for Jews. For example, in the many stories of Besa, the Albanian promise, the Muslim rescuers discuss the Quran and its message of justice for all the acceptance of the Jewish belief. One of these examples is from two rescuers, the brothers Hamid and Zemal Vaseli, who state, "We never took money from our Jewish guests. Besa exists in every Albanian soul. Our parents were devout Muslims and believed as we do that every knock on the door is a blessed welcome from God." These courageous stories open up broader questions of coexistence and dialogue that can illustrate the positive aspect of how religious people act during times of turmoil, especially in the light of the Muslim rescue of Jews. In 2012, I hosted in the Holocaust Genocide Interfaith Education Center at Manhattan College the exhibit Besa. I invited Jews, Christians, and Muslims to the opening reception. There was a speech by the leaders of all three faiths that showed mutual respect and recognition for these Muslims and Christian Albanian heroes. The local Jewish community had never heard of these stories, and they spent many hours scrutinizing the photographs and asking questions, looking at Torahs that Albanian Muslims had kept, and looking at menorahs that were waiting for other survivors to come and get. This event turned into a powerful interreligious dialogue that was initiated by the mutual recognition of courage and suffering. Questions the Jews asked of Muslims about what they were doing there, how did they know about the Holocaust, and questions of how Muslims were asking Jews, what were you doing in places like Albania, became a point of cooperation. But the more important thing was how the Jews had no idea about colonization and what Muslims were going through during World War II, especially in places like North Africa, where the Vichy government was in charge. Another story, and one of my heroes, Khan, Nur Anad Khan, who was born on New Year's Day, 1914, in Moscow to an Indian father and an American mother. She was a direct descendant of Tipu Sultan, the 18th century Muslim ruler of Mysore. Khan's father was a musician and a Sufi teacher. He moved his family first to London, then to Paris, where Khan was educated, later worked writing children's stories. Khan escaped to England after the fall of France in November 1940. She joined the WAAF, which is the Women's Auxiliary Air Force. In late 1942, she was recruited to join SOE as a radio operator. Although some of those who trained her were unsure about her suitability, in June 1943, she was flown to France to become the radio operator for the Prosper Resistance Network in Paris, with the code name Madeleine. Many members of the network were arrested shortly afterwards, but she chose to remain in France and spent the summer moving from place to place, trying to send messages back to London while avoiding capture. In October, Khan was betrayed by a French woman and arrested by the Gestapo. She had unwisely kept copies of all her secret signals, and the Germans were able to use her radio to trick London into sending new agents. Straight into the hands of the waiting Gestapo, Khan escaped from prison but was recaptured a few hours later. In November 1943, she was sent to Pforzheim prison in Germany, where she was kept in chains and in solitary confinement. Despite repeated torture, she refused to reveal any information. In September 1944, Khan and 3 other female SOE agents were transferred to Dachau concentration camp, where on 13 September they were shot. Another example is from Tunisia, in the lush Zaygoun Valley, southwest of Tunisia. Si Ali Sakat was enjoying his retirement, a former government minister and mayor of Tunis. Si Ali was an aristocrat who could trace his lineage back to the Prophet Muhammad himself. By the early 1940s, after a life of public service, he was living an idyllic life of a country square on a 740-acre hacienda-style farm at the base of Jebel Zahoun, overlooking the valley below. Si Ali's farm was also the closest private property to a German-run labor camp for Jews, located near an arched stone bridge about a mile away. There, according to Arab eyewitnesses, Germans regularly beat the Jews to force them to work harder while they cleared land and repaired a nearby airstrip, which had been pocked by British and American bombs. Ali's farm was located near the epicenter of fierce fighting between Allied and Axis forces during the Great Battle of Tunisia. In the heat of battle, 60 Jewish laborers escaped from the camp, making their way through the fields looking for shelter. The tall, thick walls of Ali's farm compound were the first structure they found. They banged on the imposing gate and begged for shelter. Ali Sakat had no idea which way the tide of war was turning. Would the Germans hold their ground? Would the Allies take Tunis? But he had to make a quick decision. He orders his farmhands to open the gate, find food and shelter for all 60 Jews. The Jewish laborers of Zagun found safety and comfort under Ali's watchful care. These stories also uncover aspects of Holocaust history that are new for many people. Many Jews and Muslims have no knowledge of concentration camps in Arab countries. The memory of the Holocaust lies solely in Europe, but it's not true. The Holocaust was an event that reached places that were unknown, even to many survivors and Muslims that are living in places like Morocco, Tunisia, Libya, and Algeria. This helps explain why this aspect of the history is sometimes a shock for Muslims that creates a tension with their interpretation of the Holocaust as an example of colonialism. Muslims who had been under colonial rule for hundreds of years conflate the reconstructed memory of the suffering under colonial governments, the Vichy regime and Nazi era, into a broader history of suffering that doesn't differentiate between the actions of the Nazis and the actions of the colonial regimes. The two become collapsed. And finally, the most amazing story that I've encountered was written in 1965 by Mohammed Arzaki Berkani, an Algerian Muslim man whose memoir is entitled 3 Years of Camps, a Year of Concentration Camp, 2 Years of the Disciplinary Center, de Jean Bourrez sous Ornay, Vichy government, 1940 to 1943. For those of you who don't know, a lot of Muslims were also in those camps with Jews because they were resistant fighters and were fighting against the Vichy government. This memoir discusses his torture by the Vichy regime for dissension and participation in the Algerian nationalist movement and ENA, Star of North Africa, Algerian Nationalist Organization, which was established in 1926. Berkani recounts the stories of activists within France who went to Algeria to fight for Algerian independence, but more importantly, he describes the concentration camps where he was tortured and persecuted. He begins his memoir with the following: I would like to let the readers know about the 3 years that my Muslim friends and Europeans spent, like me, in this cruel camp, now impossible to forget. As he describes the various camps and the infrastructure of the camp, it is clear that there are 3 different sections in this camp. First, he says, they put all the people together, Muslims and Europeans, in the same section, in the same room. But just a few days before our arrival, they were separated. The Muslims in the first section and the Europeans, including the Jews, in the second section. We arrived on the 27th of June, 1940, and the camp had been open since the 1st of May, within the same year. The first contingents arrived there on the 15th of May, 1940. Berkani's experience exemplifies the severe punishment that Arabs experienced under the Vichy and German governments, especially if they were nationalists. Participation in the rebellions in Algeria and Morocco resulted in internment in concentration camps and death, where Jews were also interned. Jews who were caught in Arab lands from all over Europe, and some who were in camps both in Morocco and Tunisia were eventually sent back to Europe to be killed. Berkani's memoir testifies to the various parties and races that were persecuted by Vichy and the Germans. This is why it becomes more and more complicated. Berkani encountered several officers who commanded the camp, but he writes that the arrival of Lieutenant Derricot was a terrible time for the prisoners. So this is a new man that he comes in. He transforms the camp into a center of discipline. He came the month of April 1941 and left in 1943. While other camp commanders would at least question prisoners suspected of stealing before meting out punishment or killing them, Derricot would punish for any disobedience or infraction. Berkani relates his relationship with Jewish fellows, internees under Derricot's command. He says he was always looking for new ways to create tension between the monitored prisons. He demolished a wall that separated the first section of the prison from the second and added 4 or 5 bedrooms to the first section. In the past, these rooms had belonged to the second section. Jericho clearly attempted to encourage ethnic tensions among those interned in the camps. He says he gathered the Jews of the camp who were previously mixed with the Europeans and separated them from the French, or rather from the Europeans. This curse, Jericho, prepared further provocations once again. Europeans were separate, the Arabs were separate, the Jews were separate, Europeans meaning the French that were resisting the Vichy. The Jews became part of the first section. He was able to push the different sections into bigger sections within the prison, and this was just to infuriate people. There is no doubt that Jericho did this with the intention of seeing the Jews cut down and killed by the Muslims. Since the Jews were not numerous, and this is Barkhani's own words, but the Jews realized his goal. The Arabs too realized the same thing. Commander Jericho expected that there would be fights between Arabs and Jews, but the opposite occurred. A friendly understanding spread between the two communities. Never could one have believed that the Arabs and the Jews in the first section of the camp would become real friends, even brothers. Whether you wish to believe it or not, they were moreover brothers in hunger and suffering and misery, in punishment, pain, in Jericho's camp. In Barkhani's memoir, Jews and Arabs usually are read as enemies, are in similar positions, and significantly are victims in both Algeria and France. Barkhani's stories continues to give an account of the sufferings of the various groups together in the camp. It shows the nature and the complicated gray areas that Arabs and Jews and others were caught in these kind of camps. So how can we reflect upon this in any way today? I presented similarities of antisemitism and Islamophobia, the differences between the two. I have complicated the nature of antisemitism, the redefinition within the Muslim world, and also allowed us to think further and deeper into what the Holocaust may offer in terms of multiple races and religions understanding what it's about. In Europe, there has been a banning of minarets, religious clothing, and building of mosques, as we know. For example, the hidden synagogues I took my students to inside the ghetto still remain to be invisible. In the Veneto area, one has a population of 155,000 Muslims, and there is no place for them to worship. In contrast, there are 400 Coptic Christians, and they have built a huge church. The Italian government will not allow the building of mosques. This should not be compared to other controversies. And many Jews, Christians, and American citizens wrote petitions in favor of a mosque, even close to something like the 9/11 controversy. ADL continues its mosque projects in helping Muslims across America build mosques and centers of worship. Jewish Watch build programs in Darfur for Muslims and African women. Muslim Americans have also condemned the antisemitisms. Hundreds of scholars and groups in America calling for religious freedom and tolerance. In Parkchester, Bronx, where I work on a project entitled Mosque in a Synagogue Project, where the imam has allotted a room in his mosque for the Orthodox Chabad community. Many examples exist of collaboration in the United States because Jews and Muslims are equal here in the eyes of the law. We have religious freedom, and what we choose to wear is also deeply important to mainly Jews and Muslims. And they know they cannot be discriminated against in terms of religion and state. Today, Jews and Muslims and Christians are working on the ground together in Syria, in the United States, in Israel, in Palestine, in Iran. And the celebration of Nostra recently with millions of Christians and Jews acknowledging one another in the face of losing and standing suffering. Israelis and Palestinians working together to create peaceful process. Women from Bosnia who are speaking out for Holocaust and Armenian female victims. Mosques giving Orthodox communities a space in their buildings. Jews and Christians protecting the rights of Muslim Americans. Muslims creating rings of peace outside a Christian church in Pakistan. Many positive initiatives are sedated, and we forget these stories. Even though we still have the problem and racialization of the Muslim today and the Jew, we have the promise of race and religion in America. In conclusion, I leave you with an excerpt from my forthcoming book. On February 27, 2010, I looked into the sky blue eyes of Albert Rosa. an 85-year-old Shoah survivor, for 3 hours as he spoke about his experience at Auschwitz-Birkenau. As I left him, he told me with tears in his eyes that he wanted someone to write his life story, since he had very little formal education and would not be able to express in writing his feelings on the Shoah. He asked me, how can I express in words how I felt when my sister was bludgeoned to death in front of me by a Nazi woman, or when I saw my elder brother hanging from a rope when I tried to defend him? I looked into his eyes, which had pierced me all day, and wondered how I could tell his story in words without losing the sense of the emotional and physical strength it had taken him to survive the horror of his life in the camps. He spoke of maggots crawling on his body as he was ordered to move the dead Jewish bodies, the gold he stole from the teeth of the dead, the urine he saved to nurse the wounds inflicted by a German shepherd, the roots that he dug out with the fingers for nourishment, the ashes he swallowed from the crematorium as he helped build Birkenau. How was I to give these events any life with mere words? These feelings of paralysis emerge as I write. How can I give the Shoah a life of its own without trespassing on politics, ethics, and the millions of victims? In some ways, I feel like abandoning this project from the fear of not doing the Shoah justice. However, when I try to repress the impetus of this work, which is to me a simple acknowledgement to the victims and Jews of the Shoah by a Muslim, I'm even more drawn to the project. The Holocaust and its enormity has become a strange preoccupation, and I live in a strange space and time, pondering what it is about Jews in the Shoah that compels me to write this. And when I reflect on this question, I hear the voices, I see the deep eyes, I feel the strength, the pride, and the memories of men and women who have taken their lives in directions that are unimaginable, so that they can sit and tell their stories to a stranger, a Muslim woman. When I left Albert's home, I gave him a hug because my words of gratitude seemed incomplete, and he smiled as he hugged me back. He said, "This is the first time in my life that I've hugged a Muslim woman." I told him that this should not be the last time, as Muslim women are not so cold or segregated as people might think. Albert and I exchanged the first step in dialogue by humanizing one another. Thank you.